All right, today I want to talk about the concept of succession, or probably it should be called ecological succession if you were using it outside of an ecology context. Because succession happens a lot in all kinds of areas. In fact, seeing as how no one lives forever, it happens all of the time in human circles. But we're talking about ecological succession. Ecological succession is a very important ecology concept. And here's what it is, maybe. Ecological succession is the natural. It happens all by itself. Predictable. It always happens in any given biome pretty much the same way. And it is the process that turns barren. Barren would be like dead, nothing growing areas into that region's mature biome. The reason we have to say that region is because it depends on where in the world you are. Now, we happen to be in temperate deciduous forest biome, and we'll be talking about biomes next week. You had to answer some questions about them on yesterday's worksheet, and I'm guessing there will be questions about them on tomorrow's worksheet also. Remember, no Zoom class tomorrow, but a worksheet that you'll need to get done. Anyway, we're in a temperate deciduous biome. Temperate deciduous biome goes about as far north as the center of the lower peninsula. At least where we are, it goes farther, lesser, far, whatever, south, north, depending on where exactly you are on the continent. And it goes down, well into Georgia. Most of the northeastern half of the continental United States is a temperate deciduous biome. So it always happens predictable the same way in a temperate deciduous biome. That is, or if we lived in the desert, it would happen a different way for the desert than it does for here, but it would always be the same way for the desert in the desert. There are two kinds of succession. We'll go through this card, and then I'll show you some pictures and talk about this stuff. Two kinds of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession is claiming new land, say Hawaii. At some point in history, there was no such thing as what we now call the Hawaiian Islands. And then one day, I don't know what it was, if I had to guess, I would guess it was in conjunction with the flood and the Earth's plates moving in conjunction with the flood, but that's just a wild guess. Someplace hundreds, thousands of years ago, volcano erupts, starts spewing hot lava from the ocean floor, gets taller and taller and taller, reaches the surface of the ocean, goes above the ocean, makes what we now call the Hawaiian Islands. And when the volcano finally quits, absolutely nothing lives on the Hawaiian Islands. I mean, at first, it is a combination of red hot lava and chokingly thick dust. And when I say chokingly thick inches of it. Now, Hawaiian Islands is lush, at least in some parts of it, with vegetation and life. I have told you in the past that we watch a TV series. I recently, now that we finally got fast enough, barely, 4G service out here that we can watch a streaming show. I got CBS or NBC, I don't remember, All Access. And so we just started this week into the original Hawaii 5-0 series. What that has to do with anything is some areas of Hawaii are lush tropical rainforest. Other areas are mostly just still, even after all these years, are mostly still just rocks and barren dirt. But that's primary succession. Secondary succession is what you would be used to seeing, and you think you've never seen it, but you see it all the time. Secondary succession is reclaiming damaged land. So, for instance, this past year, Western United States, Western Canada, a good part of Australia or New Zealand or both, I don't remember exactly, have had incredibly large, devastating fires that have just wiped out hundreds of square miles. Now all they have is a bunch of ash and some dead, burnt up tree stumps in those areas. If you were to come back in 150 years or so, it would be back to the same old kind of forest that it had been before the fire started. Maybe not as old, maybe not as thick, maybe not as lush, but it would be on its way back to the same kind of forest it used to be. So primary succession, brand new, never before lived on, shall we say, land. Secondary succession is reclaiming land that has been damaged. And we see secondary succession around here all the time because people quit farming. Over by the elementary, I don't know if you've ever paid attention, actually, even across from the high school. So when the area between around the high school and the elementary school were, when most of those houses were built, if you went back, I don't know, let's see, probably 1930s and 40s, there was mostly just farm there. And there was just a little townette almost. And I don't know what it was called. I got to think about this. I don't know what it was called, but that little cluster of things on the corner, the dancing sandwiches and the bar, oh, and the hardware store, those were part of just that little Four Corners area, a little town wannabe. And the rest of it was farmland. And so somewhere along the way, and I'm going to guess the 40s or 50s, possibly the 60s, that land, the farmland, was divided up into lots. And of course, back then, all they just did was chop it up into rectangles, squares or rectangles. And so I don't know if you've figured this out or not, but the lots on Belsey Road across from the school and on Genesee Road across from the elementary and by the elementary are long, are narrow and long, deep. They're not very wide across the front, but they go way, way back. So they might be, I don't know, 100, 150 feet by 400 or 500 feet. And all of the behind those houses, here's my point. Here's what I'm trying to get at. Behind all those houses is trees, woods. Well, if you went back 50 or 60 years, that was farmland and there wasn't any trees there. So that's secondary succession where they are reclaiming, if you will, damaged, if you want to call farming damaged, damaging the land, not if it's done right, but it's damaging the biome. So maybe it would make more sense if we called this damaged biomes. All right. So there are several types of populations in succession. Uh, I'm only going to ask you to know two, and most places don't get past three, although there is actually 5 or 6 or 7 if you want to get really technical about it. The first are called the pioneer populations, the living things that start living in a barren area first. And then once the area reaches its mature biome status, those are the climax populations, and they will last until the biome is damaged again, if it is damaged again. Now, in between there are intermediate populations, and that's what most places just have: pioneer, intermediate, and climax. Although, as I say, if you want to get technical, you can break them down into 6 or 7 or 8 different groups. So, primary succession, and this would be primary succession in our biome. And don't be freaked out by this hundreds of years, because we're not talking millions and billions. Hundreds are tiny compared to millions and billions. So, and it doesn't necessarily start with bare rock. So, for example, my house where I'm sitting right now is on this little knoll, Knoll, or a little raised spot. And the raised spot, we believe, is where is a pile of dirt that was being pushed by a glacier. And when the glacier melted, it left this pile of dirt. I think I've told you about this before, because I think I've told you can find little pieces of coal in the dirt if you build a hole. Okay, it says my internet connection is unstable. If I lose it, you'll have to wait till I log back on. Yay, hotspots. So anyway, this hill I'm sitting on, when the glacier melted, there was nothing there, nothing growing, just a pile of dirt. Probably in this case, not bare rocks. It's not always bare rocks. Sometimes it's just a pile of dirt. We have the pioneer species that come first. If it's bare enough, you can start with lichens. And then we start to get these small, what the lichens do is they aid in the weathering of the rock. The substances they secrete kind of wear down the surface of the rock, and with that and the thawing, and they hold water, so it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws and breaks little chips off the rock. And after a fairly substantial period of time, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, the rock starts to break down. You can see the chunks of rock in here, and you get pieces of soil, and that's enough to let these small annual plants. Annual means they grow and die in the same year. As time goes on, okay, so these will start to collect, they'll die, and when they die, they rot and make more dirt, and then the rock gets broken down smaller and smaller, and then you'll start to get these perennial plants and grasses. Then you get the intermediate species. It's the one that, wasn't on our list. Grasses, shrubs, shade intolerant trees, things that can live right out in the wide open. And often these are fast growing and what we would consider trashy trees. And then finally, after, in some cases, thousands of years, you can reach this climax community, which in our area, it says shade tolerant. That means that the young ones can grow up under the shade of the old ones. And oak hickory forest, oak maple hickory, is what the climax community in our part of the world is. So secondary succession is not much different than that. In secondary succession, maybe we've got this forest right here, happily growing, and maybe there's a fire. Or maybe somebody cuts it all down and plants some farm fields, farm crops. Whenever this is left alone to revert, first couple of years, we're not talking hundreds or thousands now, you'll get the annual plants, just like we did last time, except it's faster because the soil's already established. And then in the next few years, only 3 to 4 years, you'll start getting the grasses and perennials. Perennial means they live year after year after year. It does not necessarily mean that they're pretty flowers, although they could be. And then in the it may not take 150 years. It may be in the 5 to 25, in some cases, years range, 5 to 50 year range. You'll start getting grasses, shrubby trees, the younger oaks and hickories, because the soil's already established. They don't have to go through the whole cycle. And ultimately, it may not even be 150 years. In 75 to 100 years, you'll have this mature oak hickory forest. Pretty much the same as primary. It's speeded up because the soil's already established and it is ready to go. Now, if you notice this line right here, you will notice that as we go along, the soil, this is the topsoil, gets thicker. From decades, years at first, then decades, centuries even, of dead things rotting, dead trees, leaves every fall. In the case of a deciduous forest, that actually will build up the level of the dirt. Now, this is in Georgia. This is what they call a granite outcrop. All of this grayish stuff here is just bare rock. All in through here. When I was in college in South Carolina at when I was taking ecology, my professor took us to Georgia to this outcrop. I don't know, maybe it looked an awful lot like this, maybe one very similar to it. And the professor had been taking his classes there for as long as he'd been teaching at Park Jones. And we looked at, like, here is rock, solid rock, but here is this little area of grasses starting to grow, where the grasses trap leaves and the roots of the grasses find the tiniest fissure in the rock and just barely chip away at the surface of the rock. And then as the soil gets deeper, you start to get enough root to have something like a pine tree grow. And the thing about pine trees is that they have their needles are very tiny leaves with a waxy coat, so they don't dry out very easy. Because you can imagine that as little soil as is right there, this soil here is probably only maybe an inch or two thick. And so when it rains, it's going to be wet. And when it didn't rain, it's going to dry out. So that's why pine trees are good for this. They don't lose water very fast. So they can take a dry period, at least for a little while, without going dead. And literally, this rock has been there bare since, probably not since creation, probably since the flood. It was probably part of the, probably produced by the upheaval of the earth when the plates moved during the flood, the plate tectonics. Here's succession in a pond. Now, what'll happen over time? Well, okay, let me back up and tell you. I told you that I am sitting on a knoll, a little pile of dirt left by a glacier. That's the southern part of my property. Actually, kind of the southwest corner is these little knolls. The north half and the east half of my property, were where there weren't piles of dirt, and when the glacier melted, it left a lake. The lake has been gone for hundreds of years, but when the glacier melted, it left a lake. And what was living in that lake? Nothing. It was just ice cold water from, glaciers melting. And as time goes on, plants get brought in on wading bird and duck feet and so on. There's little pieces of the seaweed or seeds or whatever, and fish eggs stick to the wading bird's legs. And as time goes on, you start to get plants and fish growing. Those plants over time die and start to make a layer of rich humus on the bottom of the lake. And as more time, this gets thicker and thicker, shallower and shallower. You start getting like lily pads and so on that are in shallow water. And at some point in time, this gets filled up with dirt, and you start to get a swamp. Now, the swamp is what the northern part of my property was when it was first surveyed by the U.S. Geological Survey in the about 1830s or something like that. I've seen the part of the original survey, and they're talking about how it was all swamp, and they're naming swamp trees in order to find out where they put their witness posts, the stakes, so that you could know where the corner of the section was. So this is what it was like. This is what my property, the north part of my property, was like when Europeans first settled it. In the early 1900s, they put a drainage ditch in along the north and the east side of my property. And so now instead of a swamp, it's a field. If somebody were to fill in that ditch, my property would turn back into a swamp. And ultimately, if I were to take my cows off, quit baling hay, just turn around and walk away, in another 100 or 150 years, the property would be, assuming no one filled this ditch in and it turned into a swamp, the property would be a hardwood forest. That's the succession process. So, this is pretty common. It happened. You can't, how do I say this? You can't stop it. You can hold it back, but you can't stop succession. As long as you keep farming the ground, every year you set the succession back. But the first year you quit farming it, the succession process starts. It would happen in your yard. If you quit mowing your yard, in 3 years, there would be small trees like 3 or 4 feet tall. 3 years, probably not 3 or 4 feet tall. 3 years, they'd be a foot or two tall, loaded with grass and weeds. And in 10 years, there would be saplings all over the place. And in 100 years, it'd be an oak forest. So behind the school, when I first came to Genesee Christian School, behind the school, by that white shed that used to be a bus barn behind the school, which would be kind of about where between the white shed and the bleachers on the baseball field, or by the baseball field, there was this little area of ground that I have no idea why. I think it was kind of wet and soggy. They hadn't mowed it for years, and there was just this little spot that was turning into a forest right by between what are now the bleachers and the white barn are. When we got the school, when Genesee Christian bought the school, they cleaned that out and turned it into yard. I begged and pleaded to try and, not really, but I did ask to try and get them to fence that off and leave it there and just let it go and see what happens, so I could have a real life demonstration. But they didn't like that idea, and it's gone. But I now do have a real life demonstration. So this is an aerial picture that was taken 1984. So back before Google, that's not what I want. Yes, it is. Back before Google and Google Maps and satellite pictures of everything, there used to be companies that would fly around with film cameras in little single engine airplanes, and they'd fly up and down the road, and they'd take a picture of every house they could find. And then they would send something like this with the little copyright emblem in the middle of it, except it wasn't .com back then. They'd send it and hope people would buy it, and that's how they made money. Well, those companies have gone out of business, but their film still exists, and somebody's bought it all. And there's this big, if you want to find your house, if it's been around for any length of time, go to vintageaerial.com, the name you see on that. It's going to take some searching because they're not indexed. At least they're just sort of indexed. They'll tell you a roll of film, what roads they were on, and that's about all. But this is the house I am sitting in right now, right after it was put there. I mean, I haven't been able to figure out the exact date. This is within 1 or 2 years of the time that my house, I didn't own it then. I wasn't even married then. But this is the house I'm sitting in right now. This is my property in 1984. This tree right here is, oh, I don't know. It's got to be 40 feet tall. This tree is dead, gone. You can still see the rotting logs in the ground, but they're very rotten. They're very soft. They're almost gone. But this is what it looked like in 1984. Now, my neighbor across the street built his house in 1956. That's 5-6, 2 years before I was born. For those of you who can't add, I was born in 1958. So my neighbor across the street built his house in 1956. And he died about 3 years ago in his 90s. But before he died, he told me that all this property used to be one big sheep pasture up until the late 70s. So this is what it looked like about the time it quit being a sheep pasture. Now, this was the yard they mowed, at least this part was, and they had this little barn had pigs in it. These people raised some pigs for the freezer. But you can see over here that it's starting to get grassy, and it's starting to have little trees grow. But this is what it looks like now. It's turned all by itself. It's turning into a hardwood forest. Now it's a different angle, different orientation. So here's the driveway to the house. Here's the driveway that goes around back to, there used to be an oil well out here, and there used to be a gas well out that way. So they actually built a real road so that it's an actual 2-lane dirt road. But anyway, here's the road to the house. Here is the dirt road going back to the field. Honest people, it's 1 minute after 30 minutes. You can hang on. And it's all trees. Didn't used to be. All right, so that's a succession, and it's a really important principle. Make sure you get your quiz taken, and tomorrow will be a worksheet, but Friday we will, I think we've got maybe 3 days of Zoom lessons left, so Friday and 1 or 2 days next week probably will finish us. So have a good evening, afternoon, get your quiz done, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.